how technology can transform literacy for children with disabilities. My name is Michelle Malecki, and I'm a program manager here at World Vision on All Children Reading: A Grand Challenge for Development, which is a partnership between USAID, World Vision, and the Australian government. We're an ongoing series of competitions that leverage science and technology to source, test, and disseminate scalable solutions to improve literacy skills of early grade readers in developing countries. Globally, it's estimated that between 93 million and 150 million children have a disability. Although given how limited the data are, the actual number could actually be even higher. It's estimated that 19 million children globally are blind or have low vision, and fewer than 3% of children with disabilities attend school. Girls with disabilities are less likely to attend than boys, and those that do often lag behind their peers in terms of graduation rate. Many education systems do not sufficiently address or accommodate children's learning needs. Inadequate infrastructure, absence of suitable transportation, lack of teacher training that addresses the individual needs of children with disabilities, and poor quality or non-existent accessible learning resources prevent children with disabilities from attending or fully participating in school. Ministries of education, funders, and NGOs are strengthening efforts to create inclusive education systems for all, especially children with disabilities, and to help reach sustainable development goals around equitable quality education for all by 2030. All Children Reading Round 2, which started in 2014, supports technology-based innovations to improve quality education and early grade reading outcomes in 3 focus areas, and one of those focus areas was children with disabilities. We awarded 3 grants under our Round 2 that sought to improve reading outcomes for students who have low vision or are blind. And today you will hear from 2 of our grantees, Benetech and Resources for the Blind. But first, I'd like to introduce Christina Solom and Amy Reeves from School to School International to present an overview of our research on improving reading outcomes for children who have low vision or are blind. If you have questions during the presentation, please enter them in the chat box, and we'll have time for Q&A following all 3 presentations. So Christina and Amy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Shelley. So we have the privilege, Amy and myself have the privilege of talking a little bit about how we actually assess these 3 projects that ACR funded. I'm going to talk a little bit about just our process to get an EGRA developed and ready to go to do the literacy assessment of the students in each of these 3 projects. Amy is going to talk more detailed about what we found with both the EGRA and some of our qualitative findings, our approach to that, and then I'm going to come back and do kind of a summary of, across all 3 projects, what seem to be the most important indicators for success in helping students who are either blind or have low vision learn to read better. So one of the first things that we did in India, Lesotho, and the Philippines was look at whether there was an existing EGRA or whether we needed to develop an EGRA and think about which of these subtests should we use for these students. What's the project working on? So some of the projects were doing a lot of the early skills. They were using jotted dots, which is something where children can type their own letters and do their own kind of spelling at the very early stages. Some were using daisy players where they were doing listening and they were following along. And then other projects were doing kind of a whole assortment of things. So we had to determine which subtests were going to be meaningful in terms of what the students would be, how they would be changing. We also had to think about, was there anything in the existing EGRA or how we would adapt the EGRA that would be inaccessible for students who are blind? Is there something that's around color or is a site-based item that would be challenging for these students, and really think about how we would want to adapt for that. In each case, we involved local stakeholders, in the project, of course, and their technical advisors, but also local DPOs, disabled people's organizations, and other specialists. In the Philippines, there was actually people from the ministry at DepEd who were able to come and join us during the adaptation process. In other places, we didn't have access to a person like that. They either didn't exist at the local level or the project wasn't able to invite them in and really get them to engage. Then following the adaptation process, we would go through and pilot, of course, and we learned so much through each of our pilot experiences. I'm going to talk a little bit about that on the next slide, but what was really working and what we needed to fix in terms of the size of the Braille, the spacing of the Braille, the actual stories, what was challenging, what wasn't challenging for students, and making sure that the assessors were also administering them properly. And then finally, we would standardize that, figure out exactly what we wanted our adaptation to look like, and we would train the assessors on the final process. Brittany, can we go to the next slide? So some of the key adaptations that we did end up doing that I wanted to share with you were, first we had to think about the stimuli and which different stimuli we would want to create for the project. So in some projects, the students were only working with students who were Braille readers, either they were very low vision or they were blind. In other projects, we were working with students who also used and accessed large print in the project. So in each case, we had to determine which kind of Braille we needed to use and which kind of large print we needed to use. And in each case, we also had to think about, was Braille going to change as they progressed? So some students read uncontracted Braille at the early stages, and then as they progressed and moved to grades 3 and 4, they were reading contracted Braille, which is a different form. And then we also used different size print in terms of what the project was going to be producing for the student materials. So we had to think about that, and then also think about how we would quality assure the Braille and make sure that it was actually produced properly, which was quite challenging for us. We determined timing. So for all the timed subtasks on EGRA, we gave the students 3 minutes. That includes students who are using magnifiers with the large print, students who are using their fingers for the Braille, with lots of consultation with both local DPOs, DepEd, and others. We just determined that it was better to have a longer period of time, given the different ways students were accessing the materials. And we wanted to ensure that everybody had sufficient time to show what they were able to do on the time subtest. So we did include 3 minutes for all of the fluency subtests on EGRA. So that would be, the letter name identification, familiar word, non-word, oral reading fluency were all given at the 3-minute mark. In terms of accommodations, in addition to having different size font and different Braille that we would be providing to the students, we also had to think about what were the students able to use during the actual assessment. So could they use a reader stand? And in some cases, even it's a window that students can use to focus their eyes, especially students who are low vision and they were reading in the large print. So they would use their window as they would move it through the subtask. In other cases, students would use magnifiers. In other cases, we would have different kind of Braille mats that were comfortable for the students. So what we did with each of the accommodations, in addition to the stimuli, is we would just document what the student needed to use at baseline, so we could also use similar stimuli and accommodations, or same stimuli and accommodations at end line, so students would have a similar, we're hopefully experiencing it in a similar way. So we did work on that. And some students, would lean on the desk and put their heads directly in front of it. Some preferred to sit upright and have a stand. So we really wanted the students to be most comfortable and really simulate what they were experiencing in their classrooms and what teachers were allowing them to do when they were doing their own reading. And then finally, we really had to think about who could be assessors for these projects. In the case of RBI in the Philippines, we were able to have students who had assessors who all were Braille readers, and they could follow along with the students. In other cases, we actually had to write in below the Braille for the assessors to be able to follow along, because we couldn't find assessors who were not project staff to do the assessment. So, or even sometimes project staff were not fully conversant in Braille and were not able to read. So we had to think about what was the training and how would we make sure that the assessors were accurately marking what the students were able to do. And in all cases, with the 3 projects, we were able to use Tangerine to collect the data for the EGRA, as well as the student assessment and the stimuli and accommodations that we used for each student. Can we go to the next slide? So I just wanted to help everybody know a little bit more about some of the challenges we faced. This was obviously a really unique situation for us to try and do this with very small scale, really quick projects. So we would only be in country a couple of weeks working with the project staff and the people who were helping us accommodate. Some of the challenges that we faced when we were trying to get an EGRA ready to go for our assessments were there were very small student populations in the ACR projects already, and then also perhaps in the surrounding areas. So we couldn't always find a similar population to pilot or equate a baseline and endline test with. So we really struggled trying to determine how best to develop. I think somebody just unmuted. Can they mute themselves? I'm getting a lot of background noise. Thank you. So we had students who were only getting the ACR project. For example, in Lesotho, there was only one school for children who are blind in the country. So to find other students who are reading Braille, the same Braille that these students are reading and had similar experiences, we couldn't find them. So we had to remove some of those students who were receiving the intervention to be our pilot students, but then they didn't get the baseline and endline for the actual project. So we really struggled with that. And in each case, it was a similar scenario of trying to figure out, do we remove the students from our actual assessment to be able to pilot? And how best do we do that to make sure that they are similar students when we're doing this? Creating the stimuli were very challenging. We really had a lot of errors in them. So both when we had the Braille typed, there were just times when the Braille was not printed properly and we had people read it, but it wasn't necessarily vetted properly. So when students went to read it, they were experiencing the wrong letter or spacing was different in different lines. So just trying to have enough attention to those details and having somebody who can provide quality assurance is really important, but also challenging because maybe not very many people at the project level or at the Department of Education are able to help with that. I think I was mentioning earlier that a small student population also means the assessors don't get to practice very much with actual students. So we would do mock, assessments, but to actually see how a student would perform and how a student respond to them and how to set them at ease, et cetera, was challenging because we just didn't have a lot of ability to do that. So by the time they went to do the actual baseline, they were still maybe a bit green when they did that. The next piece is really around how do schools actually identify, is this student a large print reader? Is this student a Braille reader? Does the student have other multiple disabilities? Are they mainstreamed? Are they working in a classroom alone? What are the policies in the country and how best can we figure out who the students are? And in each case, we had different experiences of that and how the system was identifying students and recognizing them. And so we had to determine at the project level how we would identify the different groups of students we were assessing, but it might not be the same as what the school was calling them or how they were treated at the school level. And then as I just mentioned, there were definitely students with multiple disabilities that were in the population, and all three of the projects didn't have standard ways to identify other disabilities the students had and how best we would accommodate for that. And so we know that those students maybe needed additional accommodations or the teachers wanted to provide something else, but we didn't know exactly who those students were and how best to do that. So they were a part of our population in the assessment, but we didn't necessarily identify and support them in the ways that they might need to be able to show what they can do on some sort of, an assessment. So that's a little bit of the overview of how we developed our EGRA. And I think Amy now is going to jump in and talk about what we found from that.
Thanks, Christina. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk a bit about our evaluation approach more generally, and then dig into the EGRA findings. Christina gave you a really good overview of our approach leading up to the assessment of the EGRA, and I'm going to take you from there. So in collaboration with the grantees themselves, we collected quantitative data. As you know, we collected EGRAs and we administered those at baseline and endline. And then the projects also collected monitoring data and fidelity of implementation data throughout the life of the project, and that was used to supplement the EGRA findings. And at Endline, we also collected qualitative data using key informant interviews and focus group discussions. And these data then contributed to our assessments of the project implementation as a whole, and also specifically about the technology development process, because these were pilots. We wanted to know how successful or how challenging was the process of developing a new technology within the grant life. And then we also used the qualitative data to supplement our scalability assessment. I won't be talking about that in detail, but I'd refer you to each grantee's evaluation report to find out more about that methodology and the findings. So on the next slide, we have a screenshot from the report, and it's a little bit hard to read, so I apologize, but I'll take you through some of the high-level things we want to focus on. And this graphic summarizes the EGRA findings across the 3 projects that worked with students who have low vision or are blind. I want to highlight that there were 2 different types of research design across the 3 projects. For the projects in India and Lesotho, we used a reflexive comparison design, which means that we had one intervention group that we compared at baseline and at endline. For the project in the Philippines, we used a quasi-experimental design in which we had one intervention group and one comparison group, and then we compared these 2 groups' mean gain scores from baseline to endline. I'll also note that all the students who participated in the projects were assessed using the EGRA. We didn't do random sampling, we did a census of all the students who participated. I also want to highlight a few of the limitations to help you contextualize the EGRA findings. So on the projects in India and Lesotho, we did not have a comparison group. As Christina was mentioning, there weren't any schools with the same conditions nearby that would allow us to construct a comparison group. And so what this means is it's not possible for us to isolate the impact of the project. So instead what we're seeing is the impact of the project conflated with an additional year of schooling. The next limitation, Christina touched on this also, is that the sample sizes are really small for these projects. As you can see, for the project in India, it's 49 students. For the project in Lesotho, it's 21 students. And in the Philippines was 143 students, which included 72 students in the intervention group and 71 comparison students. These were projects working with a small sample size. And what it does is that our ability to extrapolate these findings to a wider population is limited. So we would recommend that more research be done to understand if these impacts would hold in different contexts or with different numbers of students. But quickly to summarize the findings, we did observe improvements in literacy skills across the 3 projects for students who participated in the interventions. Specifically for the projects in India and in Lesotho, students who participated in the projects had higher scores across all the subtasks at endline when we compared them with baseline. And again, just a reminder, that is the impact of the intervention plus an additional year of schooling. And students who participated in the project in the Philippines had significantly higher gain scores on all the Filipino medium and English medium EGRA subtasks than their counterparts in the comparison group, and those are statistically higher. And so we are really encouraged by these research findings, and we're really excited to see all them. But because they're pilot projects and because of the quantitative research limitations, we also really wanted to highlight some of the more holistic qualitative learnings from the projects, which Christina will talk you through now.
Thank you, Amy. That was great. So from all the qualitative and quantitative data that we collected from these projects, we came up with sort of 6 lessons that we think are helpful for people to think about when they're developing and implementing these projects. And really this came from stakeholder interviews with DepEd, as well as even students telling us what actually worked and how best their reading was improved. And so I'm just going to walk you through those now. And again, please read the reports. There's just so much more. So this is just a little snapshot of all the things that we found in these 3 projects. So the first one was organizational capacity to support students. This feels really common sense, but having technical advisors within your organization who know the context and who have relationships with the different DPOs and people that can help you implement is critical. And we saw that each of the three projects had different capacity internally at the local level, and that capacity really did indicate how well and dictate how well they were able to maximize their intervention in a short period of time. So thinking about having those technical advisors, not just remote technical advisors, but really in the context and with that ability to be reactive to challenges that you're seeing in the schools and with the parents and teachers, I think is critical. And we saw that, and those differences really played out in these projects. The second thing is organizations need to be sure there's a close match between the needs and the intervention. This is also kind of a clear just project, good projects do this, but we did see that there was a real different projects approach this differently. And I think really trying to figure out in each case, what is needed to help these students. In the case of Lesotho in the Philippines, these are teachers who are producing materials by themselves to help each of their students mainstream into the classrooms in grades 4, 5, and 6. So these are teachers that really need to be able to produce a lot of materials every day to be responsive to those kids' needs. In the case of India, these students didn't need that. They weren't mainstream. They were in these classrooms. So they needed daisy players and other things that the project provided. But trying to figure out where is the gap for these students and how best to provide either the resources for the students themselves to be able to address their reading needs, or is it for the teachers? And doing both of those at the same time can be really critical. So thinking about kind of a multi-pronged approach, I think would be really helpful. In some cases, the projects did one or two of the pieces, but there were other glaring areas that might have needed more support for the students to maximize the gains. I think this was one of the things that we see also in projects kind of across the board, not just students with disabilities, but the people that picked up and used the technology the best were the students. You know, in the case of the teachers, they wanted to use it and they were willing and they would try, but they would definitely adopted it slower and had more challenges adopting it. Whereas in the end of project surveys, students in Lesotho, over 70% said the technology was helping them learn to read better. Or over 90%, excuse me. In the Philippines, it was 77% of students were saying that they were very comfortable with the technology that they were provided and they could use it in their classrooms. In the case of India, students had overwhelmingly said that they were highly engaged and comfortable with the technology that was provided to them. So we really see that students are happy to use it, they adopt it quickly, they learn how to make it work for them. Teachers, on the other hand, projects struggled to get teachers to adopt a new technology, even if it was helping them be more efficient producing materials for their students. They still didn't necessarily adopt it well, and they really struggled to use it. They preferred sometimes their old approach because it was comfortable and they knew what to do, even though it was slow. So really thinking about, you know, where can you maximize the gain and what kind of support you need to provide to teachers or other adults if they are going to use technology, I think is critical, because they definitely don't adopt it and absorb it in the same way that we saw students doing. Lesson 4, this is, again, I think you'll see a theme with all of these. These are sort of critical in all projects, but specifically for these students, there's a lot of stigma with parents in the home and at the community level around sending their students to school and believing that their students can be good readers. We got a lot of feedback from parents that said, you know, their kids are absent often and they don't think of them in the same way as their other students in their home. And so really trying to have a project think about that aspect as well. RBI in the Philippines did a lot of sensitization with the parents, and we saw that really did decrease absenteeism for those students, and also meant that at home, those parents were actually trying to read with their students and believe that they could be a student as their other children are. And that was critical, I think, for the kind of success we saw. In other places in Lesotho, the kids are in a boarding school, so you don't have access to those parents in the same way. But we did see that when they go home, not all of them return at the next term, I think because there are some areas where there's stigma and other barriers. So thinking about how to really engage at that level, I think is critical, because these students are facing a lot more that challenge them than just the reading materials. And so thinking about how to address that can be critical for them to be able to then take that technology and make the gains that we want. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but there's a lot of push towards having technology at maybe a district office or a regional office, but really when you move the technology all the way down to the parent, to the teachers at the school, then you can provide teachers the ability to produce materials that day that meet their science needs, that day to meet their math needs. So rather than waiting for, you know, the production to be done at the district level and sent to the school, when you are able to get the right kind of brailer and the right kind of printer at the school level, you allow teachers to be very responsive, and those kids now have access to the right reading materials every day at the school, rather than a little bit on track, but not necessarily where the curriculum is with those teachers. And then finally, you know, engagement with government stakeholders, as we say, across projects is critical, but specifically here. If projects are able to help government stakeholders think about what policies they're using, how they're identifying what resources are provided, how they're allocating teachers, it can really be successful, because these projects can't exist in a vacuum. So thinking about how you tap in to those inclusive education policies that we see bubbling up now, and to those other resource allocation issues, those are the projects that we're able to be more successful, and we see now have ongoing effects in those schools, whereas projects that were more separate from the Department of Education or ministry, you know, aren't able to really maximize what they were able to provide in terms of technology and other things. So thank you.
Thank you, Christina and Amy. We really appreciate the background and the insight that you gave us. We're thrilled that you designed this process without having little precedence. And we know that it took a lot of negotiation around how to do that, how to document it, and we're still learning from everything you did. The specifics of the adaptation process are detailed in each project's baseline report on our website at www.allchildrenreading.org. We also encourage anyone interested to reach out to Christina or Amy. Their contact information is included in the presentation that will be sent out after the webinar. All Children Reading really wants to see the adapted EGRA process replicated and validated to ensure that all children are included in reading assessments and subsequent programming. We also encourage you that if you have questions, please enter them in the chat box, and we will have time for Q&A after all of the presentations. And I just want to remind you that a recording of the webinar will be available on our website, again, allchildrenreading.org, with closed captioning. So next, I'd like to introduce Betsy Bowman, the CEO of Benetech, a US-based nonprofit, to speak about their Bookshare India project. Bookshare is Benetech's flagship global literacy project. It's the world's largest library of accessible books for people who are blind, have low vision, or are otherwise print disabled. The project aimed to improve early grade reading skills among students in grades 2 and 3 who have low vision or are blind. Bookshare India provided human narrated audio and MP3 formats in Bharati Braille books that were accessed directly through Daisy audio players. So over to you, Betsy. Thank you.
Thanks, Shelley. So let's talk about the context first. I think, you know, Shelley gave a really good overview of what we do with Bookshare, and we've been working in India for a number of years, but before this project, primarily with adults or older students. So this was a bit pioneering for us as well. And, you know, what we found going into these schools, working with 4 schools, was really, these are boarding schools basically. And often the situation was really, you know, imagine you're at school, you're a young child, and your reading instruction and practice is basically 30 minutes a week, typically of somebody reading over a PA system, and that goes across multiple grades. So the whole idea that you have story time and that really helps as you learn to read was really a problem in these schools. And when they're learning to read, you know, so they're listening to somebody read to them and then also getting about 1 Braille book. It varied a little by school. Not a great basis for learning to read well. And so at least according to teachers in the target schools, the students we were targeting who are blind and low vision we're only at about 10 to 15% of grade level reading by second year. And so, you know, obviously that's very low. The region is pretty low, but these students have much lower reading capabilities that the teachers were seeing prior to this project. Go ahead. So the project design is, you know, essentially the goal, as Shelley said, was how can we improve these reading skills that are obviously quite poor for students that are blind or low vision. And the approach is to give them more access to materials. So that's access to Braille materials and also, you know, guided reading and more audio materials that they could actually have access to hearing more books in their mother tongue language. We in total included 131 students across 4 schools in Maharashtra. One of those schools was a pilot school. So when you see Christina and Amy talk about the numbers, we were really testing the intervention more on a subset of those students at 3 of the 4 schools. And, you know, I'll say these are all boarding schools, but they may not be boarding schools as we think about them. You know, in some cases, it means the parents aren't very involved and the students are living on site in the schools. Go ahead. So the design itself, you know, the classroom intervention itself was a mix of things. And I think a little bit, as Christina was talking about, you know, we found we needed to not just do something like put technology in students' hands. We had to do multiple interventions in the classroom to make sure that this was going to work. So one was that we provided actual materials through low-cost audio devices. And these are actually DAISY players. So DAISY being a format for books that are used for people that are blind or otherwise print disabled. So in this case, they were human recorded audio in Marathi. We also provided Braille materials. So these were Braille books, but also some Braille tools, like little cube Braille learning tools, for example. And a very important aspect being teacher training. So you can't just go to the students, even though they do adopt the technology better. Overall, we obviously had to make sure we were training the teachers themselves. We also layered in something that was a little bit new for this project, which is classroom visits. And part of this was to do the teacher training piece, but also to make sure the students were getting some of that guided learning. And in India, they became known as the story uncle and story auntie, and they would actually come by the classroom weekly. So in other words, to really implement this intervention, it was helpful to have, you know, these individuals that we contracted with to come into the classroom. And what we really were striving for is consistent independent reading as well for the students every day. Because again, part of what it really seemed they were lacking is having some consistent time to, you know, not only read, but also listen to stories and then, you know, have guided reading time as well. So what did all that lead to? I think, you know, as Christina and as Amy showed, we did see improvement across their scores on the EGRA subtasks. And I would love to have had, you know, a pure experiment where we could show statistically significant gains, but they were really, really strong gains across all of the subtask areas. I think the other piece that we found important was that students reported a very high engagement with the project, with the technology. You know, it was a very positive outcome for the students themselves. The other piece for us is that, as I said, this was really kind of new for us in India. We do lots of work with young students in other countries, but in India, really being able to have mother tongue language books and locally relevant books that aren't always in the same language for that region. So we had a goal of adding a fairly large number of books in Marathi for sure, but also Hindi, Gujarati, Telugu, and English. And we ended up being able to add 1,295 locally relevant children's books. So, you know, these are kids going from, you know, one book and a little bit of story time to having, you know, a really large collection of books available, which is useful for these schools, but also useful for groups around the region and around other parts of India as well. Some of the other ongoing benefits of the project, and this was important for us in what we were trying to achieve, is that really prior to this, most of Bookshare's books and our real approach was to put books in digital text, and that means the computer is reading it to you. That was always a limitation for us when we got into countries and regions where there was no computer voice literally existing in that language, and that was really the case in Marathi. So these are human recorded audio books, which so part of this was just having that capability in Bookshare that now means we can support every language in the world as long as you can record a person speaking in that language. The other piece is that a solution like this, and what was sort of found in the project, is that it is scalable. So while there was absolutely, you know, on the ground intervention, not a pure tech kind of solution, a pure tech kind of solution is really never, from what we see, the right solution on its own, but that you really can scale this intervention in terms of the materials, but also in terms of the actual classroom intervention. I think, you know, as Christina went through, we have learned a bunch of lessons from this that, you know, we're taking forward to future interventions as well. And I think it's a value from our perspective to have participated in really working with STS and the whole set of groups to develop an EGRA tool that works for blind and low vision students. Because, you know, it really is a challenge in many countries when you go in and work with students who are blind and low vision, because a lot of times the education system just doesn't fully know what to do with this group of students. So I think then now also having both the interventions and some of the evaluation tools is really key to that. So, you know, we're very excited about the outcomes of the project. We're excited about, you know, where it is already leading us since the project ended, and you know, hope to be doing more of this kind of work at this grade level in multiple other countries.
Thank you so much, Betsy. We're always thrilled to hear from Benetech, and we're so glad that you were able to join us and speak more about your project. So just moving us along, next I'd like to introduce Ami Mojika from our Resources for the Blind team in the Philippines. Ami is the Executive Director of Resources for the Blind, and she'll be speaking about their Reading Beyond Sight project, which supported teachers, students, and their parents to improve early grade reading outcomes in both Filipino and English. Students in their project who had low vision or were blind used assistive technology in their classrooms. Teachers received equipment to produce large print and braille materials and participated in trainings, and parents attended advocacy training to better understand their students' needs and capabilities. So this approach that kind of targeted the entire ecosystem around the students who had low vision or were blind really produced gains, as you saw that Amy showcased earlier, and we're really excited to hear more from you, Ami. So over to you.
Shelley. Good morning, everyone. Let me first introduce to you our office. Resources for the Blind is a non-government, non-profit organization, and our vision is to help persons with visual impairment reach their fullest potential in life. This is why our most of our activities is really designing activities that would help persons with visual impairment discover and reach their fullest potential. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes, that's our mission. This is why most of our projects is related on rehabilitation and education in partnership with the Ministry of Education or Department of Education. Next slide, please. Regarding our project with ACR Reading Beyond Sight, we started working with the Department of Education since 1992. We have helped them train teachers. We also help them provide braille reading materials for children all over the country. However, for the past 6 years, we started to defer providing the reading materials for the school because we believe that the Department of Education should be the main institution who should be providing it instead of us. We also discovered that in 2011 up to 2014, the Department of Education has already launched the ECAR project, or the Every Child a Reader program. However, based from our observation and from input from the teachers that we work with, even from the students, they were telling us that they are not part of the ECAR project. One, because the reading assessment tool utilized by the Department of Education and the reading materials distributed in the regional, division, and district level is not available in accessible format. This, of course, limit the participation of our students to be part of the annual reading assessment. And because they are not part of it, there's no baseline reading proficiency performance that we can use, that the Department of Education can use as basis for budget allotment. This also limits for our students to access the supplemental reading materials posted by the Department of Education online. So next slide. So we're happy that in 2015, we were part of the round 2 cycle of All Children Reading. And the main component of the project is basically helping, making sure that the early grade reading assessment is accessible for students with blindness and low vision, because we believe that this assessment tool should be utilized by the Department of Education, then as well as making sure that the reading materials provided by the Department of Education is also in accessible format, both for low vision, whether it's large print, what type of font or size of reading materials is needed, and of course, Braille, audio materials must also be available for this group of children. We also provided assisted technology to the 15 intervention school, as mentioned by Christina and Amy. There are 30 schools involved, and all these schools are public schools serving students with disability. These are students are enrolled in the regular class with their sighted classmates. They were supported by a trained teacher for the visually impaired. However, for the 15 intervention school, they don't have this equipment that would help them produce immediately the reading materials needed by the students. So the assistive technology provided to them through the project really helped them meet the reading materials needed by the students, and also for the students to utilize it and study it and use it on their own. That's one of the advantages that we really see very useful for the students. Aside from providing this equipment, making sure that that the reading materials is available in accessible format, we also provide trainings for the teachers. We visit them regularly because, as Christina mentioned, some of the students that we have identified in the intervention group, they also have other disabilities, but we cannot include them because they're in the grade level, like they're in grade 2 and they're grade 3, but they can they can read. However, the teacher who work with them need to have additional support to help to really make sure that the reading materials, the reading procedures of this group of children are being met. So we provide this kind of training. We also provide sensitivity training for the parents and for the guardians, and we also provide braille training for the parents of these children. We also teach them how to utilize the low vision devices, because we want to make sure that after school they can provide the necessary support needed by the children. In some cases, parents are working, so it's actually the guardian, the aunt or the grandmother who attended the training and who also provide support to the children at home. Next slide, please. So as Christina mentioned, and Amy mentioned, after the intervention, you can see that both from the comparison and intervention school, they really have good results. However, the results of the intervention group is greater than the comparison group, both for English and for Filipino. We only use English and Filipino for the assessment tool because that's the major medium of instructions in school. Although at the time when we are implementing the project, the Department of Education have started working with implementing the mother tongue. But we just concentrate on English and language. And the next slide will show you that we also have a good result. The intervention group has a better result compared to the comparison group. And this is an evidence that we already showed to the Department of Education. This is a good evidence for the sectors that we're working with, that if we provide the necessary training, if we provide the necessary accommodations needed by this group of children, they can really excel and they can cope up and study like their sighted classmates. The next slide will show you some of the results or feedback from the partners that we work with. One is the family engagement. After the trainings, parents are telling us that because they now know how to read Braille, they can also transcribe Braille to print to Braille. They become more active, helping their children, at the same time advocating for the needs of their children in school. From time to time, we heard parents that they also do follow-up from the regular teacher, asking the regular teacher if there will be an assignment that they need to transcribe into Braille so that their child can read it within the classroom along with their sighted peers. Next slide, please. The next slide shows how actually more input from the teachers and testimonies from the students. We have these students from Luzon that happily tell us that now I don't need to spend more time with my resource teacher because I can study independently using the technology, using the Braille display provided, using the computer that we loan for them, using the CCTV. They can study independently, and the resource teacher can have more time, devote more time to other students who needs more of her time. So it's like more of also supporting other students who would be needing more support from the teacher. The teacher also mentioned that because of the project, she noticed there's a big improvement on the speed and accuracy of the learners' work. especially with spelling. We know that children with visual impairment, well, in our case in the Philippines, children with visual impairment, spelling is really not that good. But because because of the project that we have, because of their access to this technology, because they can actually check the spelling, they become better speller this time, and the regular teacher are quite happy with it. Also, the idea of enjoying time learning together with their sighted peers, I think that's something, that's a joy that we really treasure to the project. Next slide. So if you need more information from us, you can also visit our website or send us email. So thank you, Shelley.
Thank you. Thank you, Ami. ACR has learned so much from Resources for the Blind about how to effectively support children who are blind or have low vision. You've really ensured that the environment around each of these students supports their individual needs and their success. So we're really grateful that you shared your time with us. I know it is not the opportune time in the Philippines right now, so we're really grateful for your time. So again, for more information, please visit www.allchildrenreading.org, where you can find each project's baseline report, their project evaluation, and then the 3 summative reports, including this one around supporting technology-based innovations to improve early grade reading outcomes for children who have low vision or are blind. So next, we'd like to move to answering questions. Please continue to put your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. We also are going to pose some to the participants. So I will turn the Q&A over to Michelle. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions, but again, just a reminder, if you want to type them in the chat box, we'll get to as many as we can over the next few moments. But our first question is for both Betsy and Ami. If, regardless of cost, if you had to select one particular assistive technology to use in a school or household, of course for impacting reading outcomes, what would you choose?
Ami, do you want to go first?
Okay, thank you, Betsy. Well, I think as a teacher, first you have to determine what is the learning style of the student. If the students are really tactile learner, then you have to make sure that you have this assistive technology that would help them access as much as possible braille reading material. So it could be a Perkins Brailler or it could be an embosser. If your student is both tactile and visual learner, because they have some remaining vision, then you have to have both. If the student is an audio learner and tactile learner at the same time, then you have to have the Daisy player and then the braille embosser. But the thing is, you have to it's an individualized perspective. You really need to make sure that this is what's the learning style of the students and how they can really access those information, whether it's a visual, tactile, or audio learner. Let's see.
Yeah, I guess what I'd add to that, I mean, I completely agree that one size does not fit all. I think particularly when we're talking about students like we had in our All Children Reading project, you also have children with multiple disabilities. So in some cases, you not only have to think about the fact that this child is blind, but this child may also have, other learning challenges. So the tools you use are, if you don't have a cost limitation and you can be very specific to the student and do individualized learning, that's the best. I will say that technology-wise, one of the kinds of devices that's pretty much still out of reach in any of the schools we were working in and in most developing countries are electronic Braille displays that also do audio. So you can get audio and tactile Braille, and it's all electronic in one device. Those can be pretty tricky for little kids like we were working with. When you're first learning to read, it tends to be better to have a full page. And today, these devices have sort of one line of Braille, and then you go line by line. What's in the works, which is great, is having full page displays so that you could actually have tactile graphics as well as Braille and have audio with that. So that gives you the opportunity to have kind of all of these multimodal things in one. And that's back to the regardless of cost part of the question, because right now those are very, very early and very, very expensive. But that's where we'd like to see things going so that any of these learning styles really have technology to support them. And I'd add that what we find, say in the US, for example, is that students will jump around. So if somebody has, a mobile phone and they have a computer at school, maybe they have a Braille device, they'll actually jump between all of those devices depending on where they are. So again, if you get to a point where you're talking about cost not being a barrier, having the right technology for the right student and the right technology for the right situation the student's in at the time all come together.
Thank you, Betsy. Another question also for Ami or Betsy. I know in Christina's presentation, she mentioned some of the stigma that you were addressing in these projects, but one of our participants has a question about to what extent were the beliefs or misbeliefs around children with disabilities reduced capability to learn a barrier to your implementation, and maybe some thoughts about how you address that. Maybe Ami, if you'd like to go first.
Hello, Michelle.
Yes.
I'm sorry, pardon me. Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. If you just would like to address maybe to what extent beliefs or misbeliefs around children with disabilities reduced capability to learn, how were those a barrier to your implementation, and perhaps some thoughts about how you address that?
Okay, here in the Philippines, that's a very difficult question. here in the Philippines, most of the barriers that we have encountered on stigma is that persons with disability or persons with visual impairment cannot learn alongside with their sighted peers because they don't have vision, because of their disability, and they thought that because they have disability, because they have blindness, basically they're also difficult to teach and would be difficult to learn things that the teachers would say. And at the same time, because they have difficulty of learning, they jump into conclusion that they need to have expensive educational tools needed so that they can learn. The teachers will have to be a doctoral degree and have this all kinds of training before they can actually provide effective training to the or effective learning environment to the students. And the parents would have to be rich because they have to buy all those equipments needed by the students. But from the project and from the trainings that we have, especially including the parents advocates for visually impaired children in the project, there are testimonies of parents who are really poor, who have experience that if they can also learn and understand the situations of their children, and if they can also learn blind skills, they can provide the needed support by the children. And most of the time, that support is how do we say it, the wings beneath the wings of these children that really push them to continue going to school. And then from our observation also, there are so many teachers right now who do not actually have doctoral degree, special trainings to help children with visual impairment, but because of the available toolkit that we have provided for them, a 2 days orientation as to how they can provide necessary accommodation for the group of students that they have in school, they can actually provide the support needed by the students. And they were telling us that yes, having an MA or doctoral degree to support this group of children is good for promotions, but because of the experience that they have, more than the promotion, it's more on commitment and recognizing that this is also the rights of these children, that because they are educators, it's actually the responsibility, whether they have an MA doctoral degree. The idea that it's my responsibility, it's the rights of the children, so I have to give them this right, and I have to provide the intervention needed.
I know we're at time here, though, but Betsy, I don't know if you had something you wanted to add quickly. Otherwise, we'll close up, but I did want to give you an opportunity to respond.
Sure. I just, really quickly, I think, what we saw in India is very typical, which is students with disabilities being sort of separated. And I think Ami's project is kind of a trend that is happening where there's inclusive education, where more kids with disabilities are put in regular classrooms. That obviously changes lots of things about how you approach the teachers, the schools, and, can lead to better outcomes. It can also, however, lead to less specialized support sometimes in different countries. So I do think that, but there's lots of stigma, and there are a number of barriers these children face, whether they're in specialized schools or if they're mainstream. So it varies by location, country, and what the trends are in the education system.
I know there's a lot more questions here, including some great ones about how AMI has scaled and worked with the Department of Education and the equipment, around the equipment that they use there. I would encourage you to continue to reach out to our presenters today to get your answers. They've got some good responses, some good learnings that they can help move this forward. We'd also particularly be interested to hearing from any of you who are maybe doing assessments with children who are blind or low vision, or including deaf and hard of hearing, which we haven't covered today, but All Children Reading also works in that area. So reach out to them to get your questions answered, and I'll turn it back to Shelley to close us.
Sure. Thanks, Michelle. Thank you, Ami. Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, Christina and Amy, for your time today. We're really grateful for this discussion and hope to have many more discussions in the same light. I hope our next webinar will be able to hear from everyone that's using assessments, adapted assessments to really capture the learning abilities of all children. So with that, we'll leave you with our website, and we will send out the presentation so that you can get the email addresses to contact the presenters. And we look forward to hearing from all of you soon. Thank you.